Good afternoon, everybody. Today we're here to do a wrap-up of the legislative session that just ended on May 11th. And I'm Alison Clarkson. I'm one of the 3 Windsor County Senators, which you have right here. I serve as the Majority Leader in the Senate. I serve also as Vice Chair of Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs, and in the afternoon on Government Operations. And I then send it to Dick.
I'm Dick McCormack, outgoing senior senator from Windsor County. I serve in the morning on natural resources and energy, and in the afternoons on finance, which is the tax committee, besides other things.
Hi, I'm Senator Becca White, and I am the junior senator, and I serve in the morning, natural resources and energy with Senator McCormack, and then in the afternoon, I serve on Senate Government Operations with Senator Clarkson.
So this was sort of a tough session. We came in the wake of catastrophic flooding across the state in all counties, and with some senators in ill health, and it was a tough beginning, but actually we pulled it out of the bag, and it turned out to be an incredibly productive session, making great strides in flood resiliency, land use planning, housing, reducing barriers to housing, and in ethics, in agriculture, in workforce development. We made huge strides in a whole number of things, even looking at and beginning to address the Medicaid cliff for people going into Medicare. So from healthcare to land use planning, it was a surprisingly productive session. And I just would remind everybody that we are there serving, actually making laws in Montpelier only between the beginning of January and mid-May. So we actually we accomplished a huge amount in 4.5 brief months. And then now for the 7 months we're not there, we are either campaigning, as it is this year, it's a campaign year, but we're also serving on summer study committees to advance policy so that we can address it with substantive additions, and so we're ready to rock and roll in January when we address that topic again. So we'll all probably be serving on study committees or task forces over the course of the fall, but we'll also be campaigning. And I think one of the greatest accomplishments of our session came in the 2 committees that I'm going to reference, and have Becca and Dick really address it. A bill H687, which combined several bills, but really updated Act 250 and further reduced barriers to housing and development in the state. And if you 2 would begin, but we also addressed improving government's response to natural disasters, sure. And we also addressed our river corridors. And those 2 big bills, 213 and 687, ended up landing in your committee. The housing piece obviously started in mine, but it all came to fruition in your committee. So perhaps you 2 would like to share with us the impact of this bill and
sure.
what's involved.
Yeah, take it.
Let's start?
Yeah.
Okay. First, some background. Since Act 250 was passed in 1970, there has always been a faction in the population who said that it was bad for business because it slows up development. I have spent my entire career defending Act 250. It was Republican legislation, interestingly. It was all Republicans who passed it. And but the way I describe it and have for years is that Act 250 does not say you can't develop. It says when you develop, you got to do it right. And we don't want bureaucrats deciding what that means. We want citizens deciding. And so it is the Act 250 permit for certain kinds of developments. They have to establish that they're doing it right regarding the environmental criteria that are laid out in law. It's not simply a matter of some people don't like something, so they stop it.
You can't say I don't like the color. You have to say, is it traffic? Is it school population?
Right. It's specific criteria. Although there is some wiggle room in that. Things like shall not unduly should not cause undue erosion. The understanding that development does have a price, and you just, if we're not going to live in the dark ages, we're going to have to live with that. In any case, the reason I supported this bill is that when Act 250 was passed, it called for extensive planning. One of the questions was not the 10 criteria, it was a more basic question. Does this kind of development belong in this location? And that planning never happened. It was supposed to, it never did. And then years later, under the leadership of Governor Madeline Kunin, there was Act 200, which said, well, if we're not going to have statewide planning, at least the local planning should be coordinated. That was the main thrust of Act 200. And that we will connect, so Bethel's planning should be consistent with Royalton's planning and so on. Act 250 sort of got whittled away so that it was never fully implemented. What this bill does is it directs the regional planning commissions to aid communities in their planning, in identifying areas that really need special protection and deserve special protection. That, in my view, as sort of an Act 250 historian, is a major victory for the environment. The other side of it is this. We do have a housing crisis, and I use the word crisis advisedly. And what the bill does is it identifies, or sets about having towns identify areas where the environmental protection is covered locally, where you probably don't need Act 250 for environmental protection, and where the towns can be trusted to take care of it, and where you want development, where you actively want to encourage development, specifically housing.
And where the infrastructure is to support it.
That's right, yes. And this is, I think the term win-win is often a cover story. It's happy talk. This really is win-win. And so I'm doing a monologue here. I'll hand it off to my colleague.
But you deserve to do a monologue on this topic.
And it's a great setup. It's a great setup, actually, for the work and why I think some of us support particularly the ground up towns investing in this planning, which they have to do. Where are we going to develop? What are we going to protect? And it begins with the towns.
Yeah, and I would say what has been interesting as the newest member of the delegation is I came into the conversation around 687 from the perspective of someone who served on local government and worked through kind of the planning and zoning process from that angle in Hartford, where Hartford is very unique, where we have 5 villages and each of them have their own kind of designation, and the smart growth principles of develop in downtowns, develop in areas where you have wastewater infrastructure, you have transportation infrastructure. That's already been a big part of how we've designed our community. But I had not been familiar with like the extensively long history of Act 250. And so I feel like I got to take a college course from the people who wrote.
I thought you did.
I did. I mean,
I did that college course.
Yeah, I had
this guy.
I had Senator McCormack, who I looked at every day, and then I had Senator McDonald to my left. And so I got many interesting anecdotes as well as interesting ways that the folks who can profit off of development have been able to use the system in ways that do disenfranchise the average Vermonter. So to be able to protect the average Vermonter's right to say, no, I don't want this mega mall, I don't want the pyramid mall, but I also want to see housing, which has been so desperately needed in our communities. Weighing that out has been quite a conversation. And what was most interesting to me, because we are the Windsor County delegation, was to see how other counties and other communities felt that they were being impacted by Act 250. The experience of land use planning is very different in our county from what we heard our colleagues in Chittenden County were experiencing. So to be able to have a process where for the next we put in 6 years of mapping and planning as we move towards a tiered system. That's what the bill creates. It creates Tier 1A, Tier 1B. Those are where we want to see development, where we want to see downtowns flourish and have housing, where we increase how many units there are and allowing that development. And then we've got Tier 2, which is really, I would say, what we expect to see the majority of the state fall under. And then Tier 3, which is our high value, I'm thinking the beautiful waterfall kind of locations that we want to protect. And when we started the conversation, there was this idea that, oh, you're a Tier 1A town, and then you're a Tier 1A town. But what we learned throughout the conversation was there can be places like if you're from Ludlow, you could have your beautiful falls be Tier 3. You could have certain areas that you want to protect, and you can also have your downtown be Tier 1A or Tier 1B. So to be able to have not just one blanket tier process for a town, but rather have a diversity of locations that represent the needs of that community, I think was a huge win. Some of the other bills that we worked on as well in natural resources included responding to the flood, which I think relates strongly to the land use planning bill.
Right. Well, certainly the River Corridors bill does, so maybe you could chat about that, because that does restrict for the future development in our river corridors. We have finally mapped all our river corridors, and we have really done responsible future planning on that. So why don't you two talk about that?
Let me just jump in. More reliance on mapping there.
Yeah,
Yeah, we really
mapping
liked the
again.
map. That was
Dean Davis, I know, is looking down from Republican heaven and saying, thank you, you're finally getting it.
Well, why don't you two chat about that, because that was one of our big bills.
Well, I think anyone who's watching this, you're probably in the local area around Ludlow. So
it goes on all along Windsor County and all other.
I would say if you were affected by the flooding, we don't need to describe to you the devastation that came from the flooding. You saw the photos or you were there, and we commend the people who showed up for their community and were able to support their neighbors. I mean, we were right up there at the Red Cross location. As I was driving in, I was having flashbacks of when we pulled in to make sure that people were being treated well here. And thank you to all the workers who did that. We are not going to stop seeing flooding like that. In fact, all the data, all of the science shows us that we are going to experience more extreme and more frequent natural disasters due to global warming. Climate change is here in Vermont, and we are not immune from its impacts. It cost us $1 billion this last year with the July flooding. So knowing that, and knowing that we need to be able to prevent the worst kinds of tragedies from occurring, and the loss of property, loss of life, loss of income, we developed S213, the Flood Safety Act. And the governor did not sign the law. He let it pass without his signature. But it creates a whole new set of standards and plans for how we build in flood-prone areas, including river corridors, wetlands, which are
the sponges.
Senator Clarkson knows it because I was on repeat saying wetlands are nature's sponge. So if you have a wetland above a downtown, that wetland can protect the downtown, even if it's right on a river, which, hey, all of our ancestors said, let's put us right next to the water.
It was how we all traveled. It's how commerce was all developed. I mean, we aren't going to punish Vermont for having developed along the rivers, but we are going to protect future Vermonters by not developing further along our river corridors. And we're going to hopefully work, just like Brattleboro has, to build in sponges above downtown. So
I would say that's kind of to your point earlier, where when you just have one town looking at a problem, that's not going to work when you're thinking about rivers and everyone along those rivers.
Right, as we experienced with Weston this last year, where at Weston and Londonderry, I mean, they're all impacted by the same river corridor. They all need to work to solve that and make those communities more resilient.
Well, it's often said that every year the state of Minnesota floods the state of Louisiana.
That's right.
Because you rip-rap the stream banks, that water is not going to go away. It's going to go downstream. the water energy, the water weight, the water velocity is going to be channeled downstream.
One other point I do want to say on S213, and then we'll flow down the river to another bill. But dam safety.
Oh, huge piece of this.
I had not gone into the session thinking I was going to be the person upset about dam safety. And Senator McCormack can tell you, I got a little heated because it felt like we were in a position where we were extremely understaffed. And
the dam
programming in itself and safety around dams felt very understaffed. And when you get a list of dams, and some of them are in our district, and they say poor quality, high significant risk, meaning potential loss of life, and you're seeing them on the same line, and you realize what we saw in Montpelier and Waterbury with their dams, that really lit me to go, we need to have some response. And I'm really proud because we put in our bill properly funding those departments and making the regulation not as spread out, because there were certain dams regulated over here, certain dams regulated over here, and that leads to, anyway, you can just tell how that could end up poorly. But we've started to streamline that.
So we also have good dam management here in Windsor County, both on the Connecticut River and the Springfield Dam, which has protected Springfield both in Irene and in this July flooding. So we've actually seen dams work really effectively in our part of the world in particular. Just before we pivot to the legacy of Richard McCormack, which we're going to do in a second, because we're lucky to have him here to chat about that. I also just want to briefly talk about 310, which is government's response to natural disasters, because we've learned a lot, both from Irene and from last July and August and September. We had kind of continual flooding all last year.
Yeah.
And so we have addressed that in a bill, which we probably don't want to go into detail on, but we set up a climate resiliency fund, which which has been fueled a bit by our big budget bill this year, which will address and help finance
a mitigation.
The mitigation of natural disasters. It addresses everything from 911 to equipment that we can share in our communities, because you don't need certain types of equipment all the time. It's when you need them, and we need to be able to share them.
We learned about the vectors, which
yes.
I got a real understanding of the challenges that are facing our municipalities and communities when it comes to responding to floods. Whether it's not having a vector, which is like a giant vacuum thing that sucks out debris post flood, or out of your sewers.
Yes, I was going to say the sewer systems for municipalities.
There's all these ways that we can be supporting our folks. And I did want to note on S310 something that I personally was really involved with, which is the Department of Public Works folks. If you followed kind of how valuable our public works folks are, you probably would be surprised to learn that they weren't considered first responders.
And they're not valued as first responders, which is really irritating.
And when you think about water quality, if you were in a town that didn't have access to clean water, that matters. So being able to recognize the value of our DPW employees was important to me. And I know that we all worked on that. So I hope that we can continue to lift up the people who are doing the work on the ground, because that's going to be what keeps us from the most devastating impacts.
Oh, agreed. And quite honestly, we also have to work with mitigating the impact in the first place and addressing climate change, which we are also invested a huge amount of time and effort in as we look at reducing fossil fuel consumption, which is the cause of climate change. And we have done that in a number of ways. We also passed our Climate Superfund bill, which the governor has let pass into law, which is really exciting, which enables us to hopefully not rely on the federal government completely for paying for the cost of climate change's damage to our environment, which over $1 billion last year, just from July on.
And I would say that's actually a good pivot.
It's a terrific pivot.
Because you gave one of my, you've given many, you're an orator. That's one thing that we've learned.
And one thing we will miss.
Yes, but you gave a phenomenal speech during S259, the Make Big Oil Pay bill. and I feel like you left this session with a lot of big legacy bills.
Yes.
Thanks. I also feel I'm leaving with a lot of unfinished work.
Yeah.
That's going to have the underlying issue in this entire discussion is global warming. And we are now experiencing, we haven't talked about this, the three of us, but I'm sure my colleagues are getting the same angry emails I am. There is a pushback on our efforts to deal with global warming, with particular to get off of fossil fuels. We passed a bill to expedite getting off of fossil fuels because greener energy is cheaper than fossil energy.
And less volatile.
But it can be more expensive to get into in the first place. And so we want to help people save money because fossil fuels are expensive and unpredictable.
Yeah.
And now what we're hearing is you're costing Vermonters money. You don't care about low-income Vermonters. Yeah. And I'm trying to make it easier to spend less. Yeah. So, but the mythology of the pushback, and there's an ideological pushback from the Heritage Foundation and the Ethan Allen Institute, but there's also the pushback is frankly coming from the fossil fuel industry, and it is telling people that we're going to cost them a lot of money. And my answer to those people is, okay, we've laid out the cost of our plan. Ultimately, it saves money, but we've laid out the cost of our plan. How do you propose to pay for your plan? And their answer is, well, we don't have a plan. Well, no plan is a plan. If you have no plan, what you're planning is to let global warming continue apace. And if you think addressing global warming is expensive, you ain't seen nothing yet. Global warming is expensive. Vermonters can't afford, we're being told, Vermonters can't afford this liberal legislation. Vermonters can't afford global warming.
No, we cannot.
And just look at the discussion we've just been having about the flooding and the Yes, there's always been floods. That's true. And yes, there's always been other natural disasters. They are more frequent and they are more severe because of global warming.
Yeah. I mean, I think back like to my great grandmother would talk about the 1927 flood. I feel like I've lived through the equivalent of 2, and I'm only
in 11 years.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. Yeah.
Actually, the more current floods have been worse floods. The damage may have been worse in 1927 because they weren't. A lot of the post-27 building has taken into account what happened in 27.
And the dams, the Army Corps of Engineer dams hadn't yet been built. But so the segue is Dick McCormack is retiring from the Senate after how many years? 30?
Well, you got to do a little arithmetic because I was gone for 4 in the middle.
Right.
He took a break.
But altogether,
I started in November of 1989, and I will still be a senator in January of 25.
Yep.
correct.
So if you count 89 to 25, you get one number. But it's from the end of 89 to the beginning of 25. Really, it's about 31 years.
31 years.
Yeah.
And we are so grateful for that service. You have contributed enormously to so many of our major efforts that we have passed. I'd love to hear what your highlights have been. What are the things you're both proudest of? What did you love the most? What still needs to be done? Because as people must know, our work is never done, which is why we come back to try and finish our unfinished business.
Well, Alison, I once had your job back in the 90s. I was Senate Majority Leader. At that time, Peter Shumlin was the president pro tempore. Doug Racine was the lieutenant governor, and Howard Dean was the governor. So I was sort of the and then you had a Speaker of the House. So I was like the number 5 Democrat in the leadership. And the press always went to the minority leader before they went to me. But during my tenure as Majority Leader, we passed Act 60, which made there were unconstitutional. The Vermont Supreme Court ruled that our previous school funding system was unconstitutional because the burden in towns that were property rich relative to their school budgets had very low tax rates towns that were property poor relative to their school budgets, and that means the school population, had very, very high rates, and they were often the towns that could least afford it. So what Act 60 did was it made town-to-town property tax equity, where X spending
Right.
per pupil in one town would require the same rate as X spending in another town. I was very proud of that. It did raise the taxes in some of my towns, namely ski towns. It frankly raised taxes in Ludlow. It raised taxes in Plymouth. I went to the Plymouth town meeting after we passed Act 60, and they refused to let me speak because they were so angry with me. I hadn't wanted to speak anyway. I thought I should. I thought I raised these people's taxes. The least I can do is face them. And when they basically kicked me out, I got in my car and said, "Well, I've been thrown in the briar patch," and I drove off. But in any case, what has happened is that people make their adjustments, and what it was, even the towns where the taxes went up, it was fair. It was right. Because basically Vermont educates the children of Vermont. The state government delegates that responsibility to the towns, but it is still ultimately a state responsibility. The other thing I'm very proud of was we passed civil unions.
Yeah.
And marriage equity on your watch, both of them.
Well, when I was in the
Incredible.
Senate, I'm talking about as majority leader.
Yeah.
I was vice chair of Judiciary. Dick Sears was chair. And I was also majority leader. And that was, at the time, a bit of a disappointment for some of us. Civil unions was separate but equal. It was that same-sex couples could have all the legal rights of a heterosexual married couple. But it was not civil marriage. That, to his credit, John Campbell, 10 years later, led the effort on that. I had the honor of voting for that as well.
Yeah.
But Campbell did the leading on that. John and I tangled publicly on more than one occasion, but I give him absolute praise for that. That was courageous on his part.
And you know what? I think it's one of the things all of us are proudest of for having voted for.
You know, I've been there long enough that you really do changes. That was the idea of same-sex civil marriage was seen as an outrageously controversial proposition.
Yeah.
And now my last couple of years of teaching, the young kids, what was the controversy?
Yeah.
What was the big deal?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, I think, with your legacy is that you are actually, I would say we're probably equally progressive. You might be more progressive on some things, but you've kind of stayed the same amount of progressive.
I've stayed the course.
And you've actually had more people kind of jump into a similar philosophical bandwagon to yours over time, which is really quite interesting to see, because it's some of your more controversial opinions to that point are now an obvious fact that we
Well, I have often I have a couple of words of wisdom that I've gotten from other people. I quote a lot. And
Which we treasure.
Well, I know you. Well, what it is that when I have something
actually
to say,
great.
I will often think to myself, you know, this has been said better than I can say it. So why would I settle for me when I can have Schopenhauer?
Right.
Now,
Or
this
Winston
is
Churchill.
This is a quote from, I love Churchill. This is a quote from Schopenhauer.
Okay.
And no, I have not read Schopenhauer in German or in English. I got this off a box of herbal tea. But it's wisdom is where you find it. And it is, every important idea goes through three phases. It is brushed off as ridiculous.
Right.
Then it is opposed as dangerous. And then it's held to have always been self-evident.
Right.
And I have lived long enough to see that happen.
Yeah.
In particular with the LGBTQ community. These were people who were dealt with as criminals within my living memory.
Yeah.
They were dealt with as criminals.
That's right.
When I was a young man, when I was in college, we did not think of them as criminals, but we thought they were funny. and,
Kind of like a cultural stereotype kind
you
of
can
thing.
see it in the Hollywood movies. The flamboyantly gay guy is an object of ridicule. And now, I mean, it's just we have come out the other side of that.
Yeah, well, I was talking to the Victory Fund folks who are an LGBTQIA endorsement group, and I realized I think that with the departure of Senator Brian Campion, that I think I might be one of the few openly queer members of the Senate. So we have very few, interestingly enough.
In the Senate.
In the Senate, yeah. We have a very diverse rainbow caucus on the House side, but it is interesting.
So what do we still need to do?
Yeah, give us our charge.
to wrap
Okay.
up, let's keeping our eye on the prize. What do we need to
Okay, well,
continue?
first of all, there's stuff that we've done right that we need to continue doing and do better. To just deviate from the discussion for a second, well, it's not deviating, it's background on this. The legislating is a collaborative effort, and you don't do anything on your own.
Nope.
Moreover, the people who you disagree with, or the people who you agree with, but they're not coming far enough into your position, which is often my case with my own party, where I'm thinking the Democrats have it right, but no, come on, we can do better than that. The fact is, they got voted for too. They were elected. They have the same legitimate claim on the right to govern that I do. And so you have to work with those people. And that's as close as you're going to get to, quote, the voice of the people. The people speak in many controversial and contradicting voices. So, in fact, often when someone doesn't like a position I've taken, they'll say, "You're not listening to the people." And I say, "Well, I'm not agreeing with you." First of all, I am listening to you, I just disagree. But it's also that there are other people who think like I do, not think like you do. We have a cacophony of opinions in the legislature reflecting the cacophony of opinions out there in the world. And so the result is, if you're going to govern, if we the people are going to govern ourselves through the agency of our legislature, we have to make it work among disagreeing positions.
Right.
The Act 250 housing bill is not the bill I would have written. Okay? But the other side had a point, and my side got enough. And so that's how you do that. So I would say we're not done on global warming.
Oh, heavens.
Okay? And if the question of global warming is, and if I'm on my way out, I'm going to say this as my parting shot.
Go for it.
Global warming is the overarching existential issue of our time.
Yeah.
And
Bingo.
when I had Jane Kitchell, who was a very close to the vest, moderate, cautious politician, when she quoted me on that, I said, yes!
Yes.
Okay, but there it is, that it is the overarching existential issue of our time.
It is.
We're not going to have prosperity if we don't take care of global warming. We're not going to have a happy next generation if we don't take care of global warming. And really, some people think we're starting too late. There is an air out there of despondency that we should have started 40 years ago. But now, meanwhile, we still have people saying, "Well, I'm a skeptic." And no, that's not skepticism. Maybe it was skepticism 40 years ago. But now, when the thing has been proven and you're still holding to your previous position, Winston Churchill said, Winston Churchill's definition of a fanatic: someone who can't change his mind and won't change the subject. Which sounds,
We have none of those in the Senate.
So we need to begin to wrap up. I guess as we look to the future, and you are always able to have access to Becca and me if we're lucky enough to be reelected. So we know that you'll continue to advocate for things you care about. But what would you charge us with as we go forward? In addition to continuing to address global warming, anything else you think we should continue to work on that you care enormously about?
Yes. We've had several issues lately that some people saw as a culture war of what they would refer to as the left. The claim is the left doesn't respect multi-generational Native Vermonters. That the left is trying to force its agenda on Native Vermonters. And first of all, it's simply not true.
Yeah.
I am married to a multi-generation. I think the Willards and the Grouts, my wife's family, they don't know when their family first showed up in Vermont. It's like they were always here. And but we had an animal cruelty bill, and there were people who said, well, the animal cruelty bill disrespects Vermont's traditions. And I'm thinking, you know what? Vermont's an agricultural state, and proper care for animals, respect for animals is a Vermont tradition.
Yeah.
And what happens often in American politics is that people change the question. And so let's just go back. I cut my teeth in the anti-war efforts in the 60s, the war in Vietnam, where the question, in my view, was, is our Vietnam policy a good policy or is it not? But other people said, well, are you for America or not?
Yeah.
If you're against the war in Vietnam, you're against America. Right. And we get that a lot on these questions. Are you, well, global warming, but I like driving a big gas guzzling, air polluting pickup. You're taking away my freedom and my heritage.
It's like, no, we just want you to be able to also take the bus if you would prefer.
Right.
Well, we also don't want to have your choices impact future generations with a world that's unsustainable.
But
so, I mean, that's a
Well,
piece of it.
yeah, but anyway,
So
throw it in the
other charges.
what needs to be dealt with is this. While the culture war against Vermont traditions is nonsense, it's not there, Vermont is in many ways a colonized place. And multi-generational Vermonters are in the role of indigenous people. The problem is not the left. The problem is, frankly, capitalism.
Yep.
That the economic pressures in our economic system, and no, I'm not against capitalism. I'm with the guys like Franklin Roosevelt who saved capitalism by recognizing it's not perfect. And we got to address the problems that come with capitalism. And one of them is that money talks, and the law of supply and demand rules. And if you're coming here with California money in your bank account and California standard of living in your mind, there are houses that are real estate bargains in Vermont that are not bargains to Vermonters.
Yeah.
They're beyond the Vermonters' expense. And that's market forces. That's not liberal government. That's market.
Which is brutal. And that's another
Yeah.
whole subject for us to discuss,
Remember
the housing
Bucky and
challenges.
Ida?
Yes.
That's my underline for you.
I had made up this couple, Bucky and Iva, and just the basic Vermont couple. I was Phil Scott's first committee chair. He was a freshman senator. I was chairing natural resources. And I told Phil about calling the governor Phil.
That's okay,
I
that's
told
what his name
then
is.
Senator Scott, I told him about Bucky and Iva. And often when a bill would come up before us, be on the table, Phil Scott would say, what does this do to Bucky and Iva?
Right.
Yeah.
So he got,
I think
yeah.
Well, this is great, and we are going to miss you so completely.
Especially with the
Your institutional memory, your rhetoric on the floor, all the quotes we're going to miss. We hope you will be a close friend and continue to work with us as we try and advance policies that help make progress on behalf of our constituents.
Every debate in the Senate, I have thought to myself, thank God for my colleagues for the details. I can do the philosophy of the big picture. Thank God for the details.
Well, and we welcome the big picture. It's really terrific. Well, thank you. I think there's so much more to discuss.
Yeah.
But this is good for right now, and thank you so much for listening.